Welcome to week 11 of Political Ideologies, when we look at the doctrine of socialism. Socialism, like conservatism, began in the 18th and 19th centuries as a critique of liberal ideals. For one thing, unlike the liberal view that human beings were isolated, rational, freedom-seeking individuals out for themselves, socialists believed that perhaps human beings were not self-interested by nature, but naturally would seek cooperation with one another if left to their own devices. Thus, they believed that programs, resources, and services should be distributed equally throughout society, what conservative critics call leveling. Everyone who participates in the production of a product in a socialist view should have a part of that product. Goods, rather than being owned privately, should be public property or publicly owned and controlled in some way. This doesn't mean necessarily that everyone should have a say in what happens in the day-to-day running of, say, a factory or a corporation, but that there should be a more centralized apparatus of control, and that each person in society should have a share of the profits of the goods that are created by that corporation. Socialists believe that it's social circumstances, life, that makes people appear competitive and self-interested, but that at heart this is not really true. Early ideas of socialism can be found in Plato's Republic and in what we'll read this week, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, which looks at an agrarian ideal society in which there is no money. Pride, greed, and envy would be sins, and all policies encouraging competing for profit would be seen as exacerbating these sins. It's important to note that in Sir Thomas More's Utopia, this is a farming society that didn't contemplate the complications of market capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. Bringing socialism into the era of the Industrial Revolution was Karl Marx, whose leading idea was the materialist conception of history. Basically, that before people do anything else, they must produce their means of subsistence, that economics is the motor of social change. Marx believed that society could be divided into classes. He viewed the classes as primarily twofold: the elite class, the bourgeoisie, who would own the factories in which people worked, and the proletariat, the working class, who would labor in the factories. This sets the foundation of the social class structure that often we describe society today, used to describe society today. Marx also introduced something called the base superstructure model, which looked at how the economic forces of production would influence the creation of laws, education, mass media, politics, and religion within society. He noted that the means of production, the things that we need to produce goods in any given society, machines, factories, land, and raw materials, would in turn influence the relations of production, the ways in which factories are run by the bourgeoisie. These two interactions were known as the base of the model. The relations at the base would then influence the superstructure of society, so that in any given society, its educational system, the way families are organized, the way in which the mass media is run, our political system, is dictated by the way in which the economic circumstances of society are put together. Let me give you an example. Many people discuss the civil rights movement in the United States as stemming from social activism. People will say activists got together and protested. People like Rosa Parks refused to ride in the back of the bus. And then, eventually, the laws changed within the U.S. to reflect a more egalitarian society with regards to race. If one were to examine the same time period through a Marxist point of view, they might say that we can also look at economics in this case as the motor of social change. During the early 1900s through the mid-1900s, the economic production base in the South shifted so that African American labor was no longer needed as much at low cost. Therefore, African Americans began to flee to the North in order to seek jobs. In addition, the cotton industry, which had relied heavily on poor African American labor, began to be mechanized and began to move more to Texas, where it relied on Mexican workers. Therefore, lower-priced African American workers were no longer needed in the economic system of the South. Because the economic system had shifted, it then led to a shift in the ways in which laws reacted to civil rights in the United States, changed the way in which the mass media would feature people of different races, and changed the political system to be more inclusive. These changes in law then reflected back on the ways in which production and goods were made within the United States, as you can tell through the blue loop in this picture. Brown versus Board of Education, thus, can be looked at not only, and the civil rights movement can be looked at not only as a product of activism, but also as a product of economic changes in society that made society ready for these important social changes. More important ideas of Marx's that are offered up in the chapter are his idea that mainstream ideas within any society are disseminated mainly by the ruling class. These ideas have the effect of influencing the proletariat, the working class, to be more productive through ideological indoctrination of certain values. One of these values Marx identified was that of religion, which he called the opiate of the masses. Marx argued that workers suffered from false consciousness. They would be convinced by the rhetoric disseminated by the bourgeoisie that they were happy, but in fact, they did not realize that they were being heavily exploited within the factory system. Marx's primary critique of capitalism is that labor increasingly is alienated as people are removed from the objects they're producing in the factory system. He also thought, however, that capitalism would eventually lead to social change. Eventually, as capitalism expanded, there would be economic crises. Through these crises, workers would begin to realize the faults in the system and realize that they were in fact victims of false consciousness. Through indoctrination by intellectuals, they would eventually rise up and seize state power, and then they would realize that the best way in which to run society would be through the socialist distribution of goods. Of course, today, we're quick to identify many failures of Marxism, both within the system of communist China and with the dissolution of the former Soviet Union. In Chapter 6, the book goes over the theories of many theorists after Marx who have put these theories into practice and sought to explain why experiments in socialism seem to have failed. For example, leaders such as Stalin, who were more interested in acquiring personal power than in furthering the goals of socialism itself. Another important offshoot of Marx, whom we'll read next week, is the work of Emma Goldman, who talks about the idea of anarchism. Anarchism, in general, holds to the idea that the state is by its nature violent and oppressive to the naturally cooperative tendencies that all human beings have organically. Other oppressions in the view of many anarchists include organized religion and private property ownership, systems of police, tax collectors, prisons, not to mention systems of capital punishment and execution. Anarchists might argue do violence to human beings on multiple levels. The best society would be one of voluntary cooperation, in which individuals would just assist one another without the umbrella of state power. Like liberalism, socialism has many debates, one of which is the place of anarchy within socialist doctrine. Other questions socialists might ask themselves is, in whose hands should private property stand? Should it be centralized, or should there be a more public control? Also, how today do we best escape the capitalist system which seems to be all around us through what the authors call a narcotic effect of the media, etc.? In the next lecture, I'll go on to discuss one more political ideology that we'll discuss in this Module 4, and that is that of fascism.